Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tim Von Stetten, Senior Assistant Director for Regional Engagement, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's faculty Q&A with Professor Claire Pamment. And before we begin, we just want to note a few additional food for thought programs that are upcoming. Next week on May 5th, join us as we speak with Professor Doug Young as he explores how much more powerful proteins could be if we could expand the genetic code to incorporate unnatural amino acids that have novel chemical functionalities. On May 12th, we'll be hearing from John Panetta as he shares his creative work and some thoughts on the creative process. So to learn more and to register for either of these events, you can visit wmalumni.com, find the event and go ahead and register. And we have just a few logistics before we get started here. Attendee mics will be muted for the best sound quality, so just be aware of that. We encourage you to view this event in speaker view. That way you can see Claire and her presentation full screen. So if you go to the top right-hand corner of your screen, you should be able to toggle between speaker view and gallery view. And questions are encouraged. We'll answer as many questions as time will allow. If you'd like to ask your question verbally, simply put your name into the chat box and we'll call on you and unmute you for that. But if you prefer, if we actually ask your question for you, feel free to type in the full question into the chat box and we'll get to it and read it for you. And then finally, we're recording today's presentation and we'll be sending the recording to all registrants after the event. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Claire Pamment, a 2021-22 COCO Faculty Fellow. In addition to her home department, she's affiliated with the interdisciplinary programs in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and Asian and Pacific Islander American Studies. Also with us today are Steve Otto and Gerald Bullock. Steve is the Director of Communications with Arts and Sciences, and Gerald is the Executive Director of Development for Arts and Sciences. So with that, Claire, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'd first like to convey my thanks to Gerald, Steve, and Tim for inviting me into this forum and for their wonders with all of the logistics. And I'm particularly humbled by the support of the Dean of Arts and Sciences for confidence in my teaching and research as COCO Faculty Fellow, and to the late alumnus Edward Coco and family for making the award possible. So today, I'll be talking through some of my engagements with socially marginalized gender variant Khwaja Sara, otherwise known as Hijra, and transgender performers over the last decade of my research and collaborations in Pakistan, centering the performance repertoire of Vadai, cultivated in community lineages of gurus, teachers, and chelas, disciples. Vadai includes songs, dances, prayers, comic repartee, gesture, touch, intimacies, shock and/or spectacle that customarily commemorate births, weddings, and other celebratory heteronormative occasions. Performers interact with a variety of publics in a range of spaces, from open streets, shops, courtyards of houses, and private domestic spaces, to which they may be invited or not. So these practices appear across South Asia, and in a multiplicity of South Asian languages, Vadai means gift. In this centuries-old performance practice, Hijra and Khwaja Sara performers gift blessings of fertility and financial prosperity in return for financial or in-kind gifts from patrons. In my upcoming co-authored book, Vadai, Hijra, Khwaja Sara trans performances across borders in South Asia, 3 scholars labor collaboratively, myself working from theatre and performance studies in Pakistan, Adnan Hussain from anthropology in Bangladesh, and Jeff Roy in ethnomusicology and sound studies in India. We traverse disciplinary, epistemological, regional, and nationalist border zones that have tried to contain these practices. Variously, through 19th and early 20th century British colonial criminalizing regimes and their afterlives, the fetishizations of Hijra bodies as matter out of place to classist framings of art through rigid ritual delineations undergirded by religious nationalism, or as abject others to the politics of neoliberal progress. We analyze Vidai's reciprocities in and across borders of South Asia through the changing landscapes of transnational LGBTQIA+ and liberal rights-based social movements, in which practices of self and other labeling, as well as the regulation of institutions and categories, are contested in many different ways. So I'll be introducing how these dynamics play out in Pakistan, feeling our way through Vidai, largely in the Punjab province and also in national forums. So I'll be beginning with a paper presentation for about 20-25 minutes, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments thereafter. If you just bear with me while I share screen. So disorientation, Hijra Khwajasara transgender Vidai performance in Pakistan. This is Nagma Gogi, a Lahore-based Khwajasara performer and one of my close collaborators in Tisri Dun, the third tune, a devised theatre play with Khwajasara trans performers I co-directed in 2016, with performances in Lahore, Yale University, and UT Austin, that drew from Vidai and other performance practices in conversation with documentary narratives of struggle, survival, and importantly, joy. Gogi was recently celebrated as one of the transgender debutants of Pakistani music TV channel Coke Studio with the release of Balkara, which means the beloved boy, in 2018. This song was derived from a popular lullaby of the Vidai repertoire that she learned in her youth from her guru, who's featured here next to my cursor, of her Khwajasara home, the Dera. The Dera itself, the home, offers many Chela initiates or disciples a refuge from unhomely natal families and a new home beyond the systemic violence of heteronormative society. While she's lived independent of the Guru and Guru Chela system periodically over the last decade, she continues to embody the Vidai repertoire, actively crediting it to her success in Coke Studio, despite significant backlash against these kinship and performance practices in a present discourse of respectability, morality, and normative citizenship that has unfolded with the mainstreaming of Pakistan's transgender rights. In fact, the Coke Studio's elite cis-men producers instruct the artists, quote, "Our intention here is to break the stereotype that has developed. We want to show you as normal people." As Gogi quipped back in our interview, no matter how many Coca-Colas, Vidai will never end. This culture can't end. It's the staple of the Dera system. Khwajasaras depend on it. She hints at Vidai's power to provide material and spiritual belonging in the Khwajasara home, in society, and in nurturing individual expression. Here she recites a typical opening call to reluctant patrons at households celebrating births or weddings, often of sons. Gogi weaves her performance around the closed door, a repertoire cultivated by her gurus, their relationships with the households of the neighborhood, and her own experience of being thrown out of her natal home in childhood for not being boy enough. Knocking against the doors of the heteropatriarchy, exasperated by class, caste, and religious proclivities that have denied her space, she pries them open to feeling. Now, Vidai has received little space in written accounts. The colonial criminalizing gaze put Hijra bodies under the microscope and saw their performance in abject terms as the sign of sexual deviance and pollution. while post-colonial ethnography has often essentialized Vadai for its emasculated bodies in Hindu ritual sanction. Recognizing the violence of the lingering gaze calls for more effective engagements with Vadai performance. Sarah Ahmed's compelling incitement to feel your way is evocative in this wandering immersive theatre of Vadai, which weaves emotionality in negotiating what Gayatri Reddy describes as Hijra's multiplicity of social differences in gender, religion, sexuality, kinship, and class caste. Ahmed argues that bodies inhabit space through shared orientations, wherein orientation is about making the strange familiar through the extension of bodies into space, and disorientation occurs when that extension fails. So I explore Vadai as both orientating and disorientating. So dis slash orientating. As performers generate effective relations with their audiences through repertoires that may affirm their audience's orientations, and often at the same time disorientating the same factors that work to limit Kwajasara bodies in space, bringing exclusions into sharp relief. So these disorientations shift the lens from what Hijra bodies are to the multiplicity of what Vadai does for their practitioners and patrons materially, spiritually, effectively, and relationally, opening doors and opening spaces. In fall 2019, which I was just explaining to Stephen Gerald was the last time I was back in Pakistan, I accompanied Goshi, 2 younger cheerleaders, and 3 male musicians who often accompany these groups on the streets of Bhagwanpura, seeking out occasions of Vadai. This is a lower income area on the edge of Lahore. A journey that became the short film Vadai and led to a 2019 performance event. The group's flamboyant visual and oral presence with their claps and drums received diverse responses on the streets, from shock or hostility, disorientations, to those who showed familiar orientations. You can see here through this old Babaji, and here as the woman happily opens up her door just for a chat. Some indeed invited them into their homes, sometimes recounting relationships across 3 generations of gurus that had frequented their socially high-stakes celebrations down the family's male patrilineal line. Inheriting relations in the neighborhood cultivated by the gurus who have over time navigated their way through their audience's orientations enables contemporary Kwajasara performers to secure performance opportunities, livelihood, respect, and networks of belonging and safety, even in the context of migrations and new structures where some may not open their doors. After her customary laudations of Bismillah, in the name of God, had prompted a rude response by the father of a newborn boy, Goshi bellowed out loud in the open street, "Who is this guy?" as he just moved into the area, asserting her belonging in the neighborhood over the householders, rallying up relations with the neighbors who had indeed pointed her here. With a quick flick of her wrist, she gestured her cheerleaders, Maham and Sheila, to follow him inside, while the musicians set up their instruments on the pavement, offering a musical prelude of various devotional devotional songs to sustain the growing audience. Now enraged at the intrusion, the householder fiercely reprimanded the group in a middle-class bourgeoisie assertion of personal property. He said, "If there is a burglary in our house, we will blame you," correlating the group with criminality and extortion, a trope familiar to the colonial archive. objects of fear, shame, and otherness. Ghoshi was sharp in her rebuttal, claiming spiritual legitimacy through the Islamic Sufi Fakiri renunciation of the worldly. This is our Vidai. We are fakirs. We can take the Vidai. We have been fakirs from the start of time. Now bring the boy out and let us give the lullaby. She trivializes the household's privatization of property, all the while asserting her right to Vidai. To further sustain the throng of onlookers, she signaled Chela's Muhammad Sheila to begin dancing at his door, setting the stage for the reluctant householder to mark his generosity and prestige or fail under his neighbor's gaze. He handed over the baby. Ghoshi rocked it while singing the aforementioned lullaby Balkara, through which performers reference all family members and further engage them intercorporally as co-performers in the event, encouraging a showering of money, the gifting back of the die. The moonlight child is receiving the lullabies. With good wishes, the mother gives you the lullaby. The father is giving gifts. You have a long life. Except here, the father did not give the die, prompting playful verbal lacerations from Ghoshi. Are you sure this kid is yours? You're so white and the kid is not. Ghoshi debunked his fair skin, normatively socially desirable, to question the child's paternity and the father's virility, rubbing against the raison d'etre of performance, disorientating patriarchy, whiteness, and markers of class and caste, to great amusement of the crowd. The man nervously laughed along, edging a 1,000 rupees note, that's about a miserly $6, to the performers. This was not enough. Indeed, we'd been walking at this point for about 5 hours, and this was our key event of the day. So Ghoshi now made a raucous about the low value he had placed on his son, causing the householder to again attempt to escape inside his house. Under the gaze of the crowd, the musicians and the dancers playfully pulled the householder back into the central arena. His hands came out of his pocket, throwing notes, and he danced along Bhangra style with the performers. The Quajasara performers and musicians brought movement to rigidity, opening up bodies, wallets, and spaces, showing the agility of Vidai to successfully transform fear into pleasure, turn distance to proximity, and disorientations to orientations through intercorporeal exchanges. In our forthcoming book, I unpack such transformations as they unfold in Pakistan's Punjab by considering how Vidai's repertoire structures feeling amidst relations of difference and power, as performers feel their way through performance relations in the Dera, sometimes extending in lineages which crisscross national borders, along with their specific audiences' orientations. So this includes religion, where performers often bring Sufi spirituality to their powers to bless, and will also lean in on the religious sentiments of the households they visit. This includes the offering of Christian wedding songs, known as seras, to minoritarian Christian households, through to stripping the repertoire to only devotional blessings in Wahhabi households, who otherwise strongly denounce performance. Working with dominant patriarchal orientations, praising the son, it's also significant how these performances often center women, giving emotional space in singing of a woman's rite of passage to the final comic item of charka, a kind of comic repartee that often bristles against gender normativity and patriarchy, as in this item by Anmol and Ashi. The plurality of effective registers complicate narrow abject terms as performers navigate feelings across a wide range of social differences, giving individuals skills to negotiate society, self-valorization, livelihood, and importantly, income. Also strengthening group bonds that sustain the Dera culture. As Animal asserts, who performed this particular cherka, Vidai is our biggest weapon. So Vidai, while weaponized in early attempts for Kwajasara people to assert their rights in national forums, increasingly HIV/AIDS NGOs and their transnational affiliations have become the launching pads for Hijra Kwajasara trans people to assert their rights legally, variously as a third gender and or as transgender. As many have discussed, and I elaborate at length in 2019 publications, the celebration of transgender pioneers in mainstream spheres has sometimes served to malign Hijra practices as backward stereotypes or communitarian baggage, seen even with Vidai moving into new spaces like the Coke Studio example I gave at the top of this talk. Vidai was prominent in early rights movements, so appearing in national forums such as Kwajasara National Election Candidacy of 2013 in negotiating classist religious moral condemnation of these candidates. Here, Haji Nargis, seen at the top and at the center, uses Fakiri spiritual Sufi tropes to topple the disorientations of her religious mufti interlocutor, who had claimed the community to be nothing but satanic. She asserted her powers from the emotional bonds cultivated in her neighborhood. As she told me, we go to every house and we know what people's problems are. But the politicians, say for example, the one from my constituency, does not know that this mother has lost her son and the child is in the world without a father, but we do. Such strategies were in sharp contrast with the 2018 elections, on the heels of the Transgender Protection of Rights Act, indeed a milestone in recognizing the right of gender self-identification and self-determination without biomedical gatekeeping. And yet it also criminalized begging and cast shade on kinship structures, which could have implications for Vidai and its practitioners as bad trans subjects. Indeed, the 2018 political candidates spoke in the language of liberal rights, heralded as the first transgender citizens who were contesting elections, showing blatant amnesia over earlier candidacy. One Kwajasara candidate contesting from Islamabad, who had hitherto been a prominent voice against the Guru Chela kinship system, calling it exploitative and oppressive, urged voters to give the vote and not the note, to end the culture of begging, dancing, and sex work under Kwajasara gurus, working public feeling against these practices. How significant these national discourses are to the daily work of Vidai in their neighborhoods is as yet unclear, however. Guru Nadeem of Lahore Mazan Chungi asserts, Vidai has been going on just the same and will continue to, rubbing against the grain of a narrative of decline. Jessica Hinchey analyzes the settler colonial tactics of bio and cultural elimination used against Hijra communities in the colonial period, with the aim that they should die out. Guru Nadeem shrugs at these histories, proudly asserting that her guru, Haji Ramazan, would still perform Vidai even in the colonial period. She tells, they wouldn't do song and dance in those days or dress in women's clothes, but still Vadai went on. These examples, both historical and the contemporary, from the streets to national forums, indeed exemplify the repertoire's effective entanglements in everyday struggle, offering at once continuation as well as transformation, straight lines and deviations, orientations and disorientations. In playing with, in, and across a multiplicity of boundaries, genders, sexualities, class, castes, economic status, religious compositions that have socially set them apart, Vadai remains edgy to bounded formal constraints. As such, Vadai's contours resist easy definition, and pinning down this evasive form would be of little service to its continued transformations. To the theatre discipline, with its codifications and canons, Vadai also knocks on the door of its racialized, class, gender, nationalist-based hierarchies, calling for new orientations, affective, sensorial, and relational. Thank you.
So Claire, thanks for that. This is Steve, in case you're still set to speaker view. There's so many things I want to ask you about, and I want, of course, for our participants to also have a chance to ask questions. Let me just remind everybody that if you want to ask a question of Claire, put your name in the chat. It's that little box at the bottom of your screen, click on chat. Or feel free to get our attention and ask Claire yourself what's on your mind. Claire, a little bit about your plans for how you might use your COCO Fellowship. You mentioned it in your introduction, but I'm curious, you have a book in process, right? And you have other plans?
Yes, indeed. I have this book in progress, which has itself been a lifeline during the pandemic. The ability for 3 scholars who cannot meet in person, but frequently crisscross our own border zones on Zoom, has been a real joy during the last year. So we will continue to write that, and I am also hoping to travel, but that means navigating all kinds of physical borders in pandemic. I'm on leave, academic leave, for the whole of next year. And Vadai has also showed up in areas of UK, in Manchester and in Birmingham. I know of several groups who are performing there. So my plan was to go to the UK and then travel to Pakistan. But indeed, with the rise of COVID-19 in Pakistan, borders are closing once again. So we will have to see what physical movement possibilities entail. But this book will be one of the great boons of the COCO Fellowship time and monies. Thank you.
I know we're all thinking about the situation over there in Pakistan and India, which, you know, given your deep roots there, is especially troubling, I think. I wanted to ask you about the part of your presentation. I think this is so wonderful, where the interaction with the resident on the street, where he is resistant and there's a crowd that's gathering, and she, can I use she? Is she good as a pronoun for the performer?
For this particular one, yes.
Okay, so, but she doesn't just say, I mean, it's like, you know, in this country, if someone came to their front door and said, get off my property, you'd have to go with that or they'd call the police. But in this much more intimate community, in this narrow street, there are other neighbors, there are her musicians, there's the man who answered the door, and she negotiates. She teases, she cajoles, she says, you know, she justifies, and he, and you know, presumably the participants are part of this, right? They're chiming in, and there's music and there's movement, and something happens, right? What you call is this, you were talking about this unbending. It seems so, so highly textured and deeply individual and personal and right there on the spot. I'm just curious, how do you get your students to experience this when you teach this?
Yeah, how do I get my students to experience this? I wish I could take them onto Lahore's streets with me. I've been lucky to have taught various courses at William and Mary, including transgender performance and activism, which explores all kinds of performance and activism, both in the US and globally, along with a course of theatre and performance in Muslim worlds. And for some of those students, just getting beyond the fact that there are Khwaja and trans people who enjoy various degrees of visibility and social acceptance and maneuvering itself is a huge sort of milestone amidst entrenched stereotypes and perceptions of Muslim societies. So this also gives great confidence for minoritarian students who do find a lot of relationality with these communities. So we had the opportunity to bring in, as part of a Call 300 program a couple of years back, Indian Hijra performer who actually made those experiences very immediate. But I also have members of my T3 Dawn group who have Skyped into the class previously. And I think it's relational experiences and embodied experiences that indeed drive this work and the teaching of it. So in courses such as transgender performance, you will often have students who come to the class who are deeply invested in those very worlds, and others who are perhaps taking it for a course credit or as on the side of observers. And as the course goes on, students begin to realize that gender regimes affect them in profound ways, and suddenly begin taking on drag themselves from wherever side of the spectrum of gender they inhabit. So that's not a quick answer, Steve, but there are many ways of bringing students into these worlds, suffice to say.
So I have a quick follow-up, and I know Emily has a question too, but if you'll forgive me, Emily, it seems to me, so I'm still on this direct interaction, which is so different from what we're seeing in the United States, where people stand off in the corner and kind of yell at each other through TV or social media. Can you just comment a little bit on how theater, which, except for the past year and a half, traditionally is in person, right, with live audiences and live actors, theater seems to me to be a very useful medium for exploring exactly the kinds of things you're studying, because it is a form of theater, what's happening there on the street, for example. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and these practices have often been looked at exclusively in terms of religion and ritual rather than the arts, which Dave Mason is here, can tell you, are super interconnected realms. But the embodiment, the sensorial, are part of our medium and its many different incarnations. And yet the theatre medium has often been an exclusionary lens in the way these practices have been sidelined. So the expansion from theatre studies into performance studies, which gets us into worlds of performance in everyday life, as well as more codified aesthetic gestures across that whole, again, spectrum, allows us to engage with these practices for the sensorial, for their aesthetic, which call upon multiple aesthetic genres in a very sort of porous way of bringing in. When we did the performance of Tea Street Dawn, which was in a proscenium arch stage theatre, which was an unfamiliar space to many of our performers. One had done a lot of theatre, but the others had, some of them had been doing Vidai, some of them had been doing dance functions. They'd all had experience of performance, but very few of them had experience of theatre. So building up trust in this particular theatre space, which has a separation of audience and performance, and working ways to sort of blur that separation, the physical separation, was one of our navigations in a long workshop process indeed. Yes.
Emily, hi Emily. Give it a shot. I think you can, there you go.
Hi, yeah, nice to see you all. Thank you so much for this presentation, Claire. It's really inspiring, even though I know about your work, just the way that you allow us to see, like I was also really found very compelling that scene that you described in the street where they interact, and it almost felt like we were there. So I just wanted to say that the way you presented was so compelling. And I was wondering, because I know that in addition to being a scholar, you're also a director and a theater creator yourself. And I was wondering if there are particular things that you've learned from the Vidai performers that you apply in your own theater practice when you're working with William & Mary students or with other actors, if there are any techniques of performance that you've adopted from working with them.
Thank you, Emily. Great question. In terms of my own practice, I mean, first I'll talk about my practice with this community in particular, and then translations. In 2019, when I was doing not theatre, but a film with some old student collaborator filmmakers of mine from my teaching days in Pakistan, I was acutely aware of the camera's presence, which I don't often bring out in a lot of my field work, and what it does in terms of the ocular. This is something one of my collaborators, Jeff Roy, talks about a lot as well in his thesis of his collaborations. And yet it was also a kind of toy prop, which allowed the performers to gesture where the attention of the camera should be. And when we took Vidai, and we filmed Vidai in the streets, and then we had I organized a performance program where basically the draft of the film could be shown to the performers themselves, and we could bring in lots of audience members who could pay the performers money. So it was a reciprocal economic collaborative gesture too. And we had a lot of trans and Kwajasara audiences who gave their very visceral feedback to the performance and to the film. And that was super telling and affirmative. And it's a process which doesn't happen enough with the new film and other kinds of performances, such as the Coke Studio episode, We Want to Show You as Normal People, of this kind of top-down hierarchical relationship. So in terms of my performance experiences more broadly in the world as a theatre maker and performance practitioner, I mean, it just further highlights like the laboring collectively and making a little more horizontal the director to the performer relationship. I do a lot of devising work, so that too encourages those horizontal relationships. Yes, thank you.
Emily, any follow-up on that, or are you good?
I'm good for right now. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, we have a question from Laura.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I was very first of all, thank you for the presentation. I was very intrigued by something you made a note of earlier when you said that one individual said that, but I went on, but it sounds like it took a very different form. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on how these marginalized communities resisted colonialism.
Thank you. So scholars who have done historical archival work, such as Jessica Hinchey, have shown the limits of the panoptic colonial gaze, which tried to define which bodies were to be criminalized and which weren't. And those schemes were ultimately a failure, although they had great negative effects. The legislation had to be finally pulled back because they just could not police with the visual optic. They would be policing male performers known as bands, which I've also written about extensively, the topic of my first book, because these were male comic performers doing cross-dressing, so they would get held up for appearing to be hijra, and then found out that actually they were not emasculated, so they weren't really hijra, so then they were let free. So the spectrum actually of bodies that comprise hijra communities made these regimes like these bodies were impossible to police. And the hints that I have from the contemporary performers I'm talking to is that quite simply the fluidity of the repertoire. They could appear with or without women's dress. They could appear with or without performance. So if song and dance was under the radar, they would come in and do prayers instead. So I think there's all kinds of different tactics at work. And indeed, the survival of these communities today, and in some cases, the contiguous family lines, which are in active communication between definitely India and Pakistan in some lineages, and also between Bangladesh and India. A testament to those historical formations being revived and relived and surviving. So I think many different ways. And Hinchey also shows us that the colonial regimes were not like uniform across the whole of historical India, that they had certain regional specificities too. So I think the uneven nature of policing and hijra communities' navigation through regimes. Thank you, Laura.
Gerald, I think you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Claire, for the fantastic presentation. One question that I had was, made me think of it when Emily was speaking about your directing, that hopefully when your leave is over, you've returned, and our beautiful new Phi Beta Kappa Hall will be in place in early 2023. What's something that you would like to direct or produce that's been on your wish list for a top of the line arts facility that this new building will be, that you'd like to try or to present to our campus community?
Yes, we're all really excited about the new building. It's now long awaited, but it's also been fun without it. The last piece I directed at William and Mary was actually in the Wren building as a sort of site-specific promenade piece. So putting me back into a theatre building, I've actually got very mixed feelings about. But one piece I've been wanting to do for a while has the starting point of the Panchatantra, which are these fables which travel India, show up in Syria, other places in the Middle East, and they're just ripe for exploration. They're sort of animal fables, and taking a source like that, which also just to again sort of pull on Emily's question, you know, one of the problems of theatre as well is casting processes, which sometimes specify this character must be this Asian, this gender, and all the rest of it. And so to further engage gender fluid, open casting processes, and take a devising process to how we reanimate those tales, and you know, pull on AIMS and the wonderful artistic ventures that AIMS is bubbling with at the moment, with colleagues like Emily now in our orbit, so yes, I would like to play with the Panchatantra animal fables.
And Claire, could you remind everyone what AIMS stands for, the acronym?
Asian Middle East Studies.
An interdisciplinary program at William Mary.
Yes, thank you very much. It's an interdisciplinary program, yes.
So easy to use our own shorthand. We have a question from David.
Yeah, thanks for giving me some time to ask a question. And Claire, thanks for this this enlightening presentation. I just have a quick nod back, perhaps, to Laura Nayer's question about the colonial situation. What's the legal situation for Quadricera now? Is the policing of bodies different now? And whatever the legal status of Quadricera might be right now, what effect on that status has performance had?
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, there's now such a burgeoning number of scholars, not only in Pakistan, but also in India and Bangladesh, who are writing about the continuities of the kind of revival of the colonial policing, even in the so-called emancipatory period of progressive rights legislation. So the anti-performance prerogatives are really there from the get-go. In 2019, when the Supreme Court in Pakistan takes notice of civil rights infringements upon Quadricera communities, and I've written and published about this. It's so contradictory because it was actually a big performance protest, which brought those abuses to the foreground in any case, and yet those particular activists and practitioners were isolated from the early Supreme Court rulings. So the anti-performance prerogative has been there from 2019 and is exemplified in this anti-begging clause. Many people don't see any difference between begging and vadai. And so it brings vadai somewhat precarious. And the legislation passed in India directly names bonded labor as criminal under their transgender rights legislation, and Vibhav Saria has written beautifully about this. And so I think across borders, the discourse against Guru Chela, against the labor practices cultivated within those kinship formations is very fragile. And yet the work is continuing. I think these practices have always been contested, which persuades us not to look at a linear narrative of decline. But certainly precarity is there in the moment.
I can't let go of that encounter that you described that Emily was also taken with. And I want to ask you about a couple of things about it. The language that was used about I am weaving a, I can't remember the word, but the idea of creating a performance that in your example was so organic and responsive to the situation. And it seemed like because of that very personalized tailoring and sort of responsiveness resulted in something, in a connection, right? In a change. And the words I wrote down, you said there's a shift that happens. And I wrote down from something rigid to something fluid, to something more open. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of fruits of these interactions along that vein, because I suspect that when we compare the fragility versus the persistence, it's those results that are leading to the persistence. But I'm not sure about that. Could you maybe talk about that?
I love this image of tailoring that you've pulled out. So yeah, the weave, performers going to a household, even if they don't know those householders, of quick observations of what religious signs do they have, which will then inform what do we perform on this particular occasion. But also, as I mentioned, within certain areas, often where the Hijra Khwajasara household is, those particular houses are allotted to the particular Khwajasara family. So the guru and their guru and their guru, on and on and on, will have cultivated relationships with at least some houses in that neighborhood. Yes, there's mobility and there's migrations. So some of the older households may have moved on, but there will always be some kind of key supporters within those areas. And so the kind of, the performance repertoire cultivated over time across the generations give that robust and that sustenance. And this group is known to be very territorial because those relationships are so critical to their continued survival and the continued survival of this particular practice. Does that answer your question, Steve? So yeah, weaving the past and weaving presents together in futures.
We could talk about it all day. I find it so interesting about how these interactions between two people can be affected by one side consciously trying to move it towards something that's more flexible. But we're almost out of time. I wondered, Claire, if you had any final thoughts that you wanted to wrap up before we turn it back to Tim.
I think to give final thoughts to this practice might be averse to its continuations in our collective memories. So no, except thank you very much for all of you for your presence, and thank you, Steve and Gerald, for bringing me in once again.
And thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Claire, and thank you everyone for good questions. This is a great presentation. Tomorrow morning, you will receive an email with the recording as well as a survey link. And I'll actually put the survey link here in the chat box. If you're able to fill it out, that's great. It helps us, think about future events what worked well, what didn't. So please do fill that out. We'd appreciate your feedback. But thanks so much again and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye.